The flight attendants barely noticed the young woman in seat 14B during the pre-flight safety demonstration. Frida Thompson sat with her hands folded, blonde hair tucked behind her ears, watching the emergency procedures with an intensity that seemed oddly misplaced for someone who appeared to be just another nervous European tourist. What they didn't know was that in 6 hours, this quiet passenger would take control of their aircraft and save 127 lives, using skills that nobody on board could have imagined she possessed. The morning sun streamed through the terminal windows. At Frankfurt International Airport, as passengers shuffled toward Gate A23, Flight LH447 to New York was running on schedule, and the usual pre-boarding chaos filled the waiting area. Business travelers tapped impatiently on their phones. Families wrangled excited children, and vacation-goers clutched their carry-on bags with the nervous energy of adventure ahead. Among them sat Frida Thompson, a 26-year-old with the kind of unremarkable presence that made her invisible in crowds. She wore simple jeans and a navy sweater, her shoulder-length blonde hair falling like a curtain around her face as she read a paperback novel. To anyone watching, she might have been a graduate student heading home after a semester abroad, or perhaps a young professional taking her first international vacation. The boarding announcement crackled through the terminal speakers in 3 languages. Frida closed her book and gathered her small backpack, moving with the crowd toward the jetway. She handed her boarding pass to the gate agent with a polite smile and a softly accented, "Thank you," that suggested English wasn't her first language. On board the wide-body Airbus A330, she found her window seat in row 14 and settled in quietly. The flight attendants moved through their pre-flight routine with practiced efficiency. Sarah Chun, the senior flight attendant, barely glanced at the young woman as she checked overhead bins and ensured seatbelts were fastened. In her 15 years of flying, Sarah had developed an ability to quickly assess passengers, categorizing them into types that helped her anticipate who might need extra attention during the flight. The woman in 14B fell into the quiet European tourist category, someone who would likely sleep most of the way across the Atlantic and require minimal interaction. Sarah noticed she declined the pre-departure beverage service with a small shake of her head and immediately returned to her book once the safety demonstration began. Captain Michael Rodriguez, a veteran pilot with over 20,000 flight hours, completed his final pre-flight checks in the cockpit. His co-pilot, First Officer Amanda Walsh, ran through the weather briefings and flight plan details. The conditions were perfect for their 8-hour journey to JFK. Clear skies, minimal turbulence expected, and favorable tailwinds that might even get them to New York ahead of schedule. "Beautiful day for flying," Rodriguez remarked as they received clearance for pushback. "Should be a smooth one." Back in 14B, Frida adjusted her seatbelt and glanced out the window as the aircraft began its taxi to the runway. Frankfurt's skyline gleamed in the morning light, and she could see other aircraft queued for departure. Her expression remained neutral, almost detached, as if she were simply going through the motions of air travel without any particular enthusiasm for the journey ahead. What none of her fellow passengers could have guessed was that Frida had spent the previous 4 years as a combat medic and emergency response specialist with the Norwegian Armed Forces. She had deployed twice to Afghanistan, served on mountain rescue operations in the Arctic, and completed advanced trauma training that few civilian medical professionals ever received. Her quiet demeanor wasn't shyness or nervousness about flying. It was the controlled calm of someone who had learned to observe everything while revealing nothing. The engine spooled up for takeoff, and Flight LH447 lifted off smoothly into the clear German sky. Most passengers settled in for what they expected would be a routine transatlantic flight. The businessman in 12A opened his laptop. The family in row 16 distributed coloring books to their children, and the elderly couple in 15C shared a crossword puzzle. Frida opened her book again, but her eyes weren't really focused on the pages. Instead, she was unconsciously cataloging details: the flight crew's movements, the location of emergency equipment, the passenger demographics around her. It was a habit ingrained through military training, situational awareness that operated on autopilot even during the most mundane circumstances. She had no way of knowing that 3 hours into the flight, her training would shift from background habit to life-saving necessity. As Flight LH-447 reached its cruising altitude of 37,000 feet, the cabin settled into the familiar rhythm of long-haul travel. The meal service began, and the flight attendants moved through the aisles with their practiced choreography of efficiency and politeness. Frida accepted the chicken dinner with a quiet danka and ate methodically while continuing to read her novel. Sarah Chun noticed that the young woman barely looked up during the meal service, responding to questions with minimal eye contact and simple nods. In Sarah's experience, passengers like this were either extremely introverted or dealing with flying anxiety. Either way, they rarely caused problems and usually spent most of the flight sleeping or absorbed in their entertainment. "First time to New York?" Sarah asked during the meal collection, attempting to be friendly. "No," Frida replied softly, her slight accent making the word sound almost apologetic. She offered no additional information, and Sarah moved on to the next row without pressing for conversation. Behind her, 2 business travelers in suits were deep in discussion about a merger their company was negotiating. In row 13, a group of college students from Munich chatted excitedly about their semester abroad program. The contrast made Frida seem even more withdrawn, an island of silence in the social atmosphere of the cabin. Flight attendant James Morrison, working his 3rd year with the airline, was collecting trash when he noticed the woman in 14B. She had finished her meal but was sitting strangely rigid, her hands placed precisely on her armrests. Her breathing seemed controlled, almost mechanical. "You okay?" he asked with professional concern. "Can I get you anything for air sickness? Some ginger ale, maybe?" Frida looked up at him for the first time since boarding, and James was struck by her pale blue eyes. They were steady and alert in a way that seemed inconsistent with someone who might be feeling unwell. "I'm fine, thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. James nodded and moved on, but something about the exchange nagged at him. The woman wasn't sick, she was hyper-alert. He'd seen enough nervous flyers to recognize the difference, but this wasn't typical flight anxiety either. It was more like she was listening for something, waiting for something. In the galley, Sarah was reorganizing supplies when she overheard James mention the quiet passenger in 14B. "She's probably just a nervous flyer who doesn't want to admit it," Sarah said, refilling coffee containers. "Some people get embarrassed about flying anxiety, especially Europeans. They think they should be more worldly about travel." "Maybe," James replied, but he wasn't convinced. "There's something different about her. She's not nervous, she's watchful, like she's expecting something to happen." Sarah glanced toward row 14, where Frida had returned to her book. The observation wasn't entirely wrong. There was something unusually attentive about the way the young woman held herself. But Sarah had seen all types of passengers over the years, and she'd learned not to read too much into individual quirks. "As long as she's not bothering other passengers, she's fine," Sarah concluded. "Some people just don't like to socialize on flights." What neither flight attendant understood was that Frida's apparent withdrawal was actually the opposite of what they perceived. Rather than being disconnected from her surroundings, she was hyper-connected to them. Her military training had taught her to maintain a low profile while staying alert to environmental changes, potential threats, and developing situations. She had already noted the location of every emergency exit, identified passengers who might be able to assist in a crisis based on their physical capability and apparent comfort with the situation, and unconsciously mapped the most efficient routes through the cabin. When a child in row 18 had started Crying during takeoff, she had assessed whether the distress indicated a medical issue or normal discomfort. When an elderly man had gone to the restroom and taken longer than usual, she had timed his absence and prepared to notice if he needed assistance. This level of situational awareness was as natural to her as breathing, but it created an intensity that civilian observers often misinterpreted as anxiety, rudeness, or social awkwardness. The irony was that while the flight crew categorized her as someone who would likely need minimal attention and couldn't contribute much in an emergency, Frida possessed more relevant crisis training than anyone else on the aircraft. She held certifications in advanced trauma medicine, high-altitude rescue operations, and emergency leadership under extreme stress. She had saved lives in combat zones and had trained extensively in aircraft emergency procedures as part of her military service. But sitting quietly in seat 14B, reading a romance novel and declining extra pretzels, she appeared to be exactly what the flight attendants expected: a shy young tourist who would sleep through most of the flight and disembark in New York without having made any impression on the crew or her fellow passengers. 3 hours into the flight, as the cabin lights dimmed and most passengers dozed or watched movies, Frida remained alert. Her book was closed now, and she stared out the window at the endless expanse of ocean below, her reflection barely visible in the aircraft's small portal. She wasn't expecting trouble, but she was ready for it. That readiness, invisible to everyone around her, would soon make all the difference. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 4 hours into the flight, the cabin had settled into the quiet rhythm of overnight travel. Most passengers were sleeping under airline blankets, their window shades pulled down to block out the bright sunlight streaming across the Atlantic. The flight attendants had dimmed the cabin lights and were taking turns resting in the crew quarters. Frida remained awake in 14B, her internal clock still adjusting to the time zone changes. She had switched from her novel to quietly observing the cabin dynamics, a habit that had kept her alive during her deployments. The businessman in 12A had finally closed his laptop and was snoring softly. The family with young children had managed to get everyone settled, though the toddler in 16C occasionally whimpered in his sleep. During the crew's hourly safety walk, James Morrison noticed that the quiet European woman was still awake, staring out her window at the ocean below. He approached with a water bottle and a concerned expression. "Can't sleep?" he asked quietly, trying not to wake nearby passengers. "I have some herbal tea that might help." Sometimes the cabin pressure affects people differently. Frida turned from the window, her pale eyes reflecting the dim cabin lighting. "I don't need anything, thank you." "Long flights can be tough," James persisted, interpreting her wakefulness as discomfort. "Are you visiting family in New York? First time traveling alone internationally?" The questions carried the gentle condescension that flight attendants often used with passengers they perceived as inexperienced travelers. Frida recognized the tone immediately. It was similar to how military instructors spoke to new recruits they assumed wouldn't make it through training. "I travel often," she replied simply, offering no elaboration. James nodded and moved on, but not before exchanging a look with Sarah Chen, who was checking on passengers in the rows ahead. The look conveyed what they both thought: young European tourist, probably overwhelmed by the long journey, trying to seem more worldly than she actually was. In the galley, their quiet conversation confirmed these assumptions. "She's probably never been on a flight this long," Sarah whispered as she restocked napkins. "I've seen it before. They book these ambitious trips without realizing how exhausting international travel can be. She's trying to act experienced, but you can tell she's out of her element." "Should we keep an eye on her?" James asked. "She seems pretty tense." "She's fine," Sarah replied. "Some people just handle stress by withdrawing." As long as she's not bothering other passengers or becoming disruptive, we let her cope her own way. What neither flight attendant realized was that Frida's stress was actually the opposite. She was completely comfortable in the aircraft environment, more comfortable than most of the crew realized. During her military service, she had flown in transport planes, helicopters, and civilian aircraft across 3 continents. She understood aviation systems, emergency procedures, and aircraft limitations better than many commercial passengers ever would. Her apparent tension was actually heightened alertness, a state of readiness that had been trained into her through years of deployment in unpredictable situations. In Afghanistan, maintaining this level of awareness had been the difference between coming home safely and not coming home at all. The irony deepened when Captain Rodriguez made his routine passenger announcement updating their position and estimated arrival time. His voice carried the authoritative calm that passengers found reassuring, but Frida noticed subtle stress markers that suggested he was managing some kind of developing situation in the cockpit. She had learned to read vocal patterns during her medical training, where recognizing subtle changes in a patient's speech could indicate emerging complications before vital signs showed distress. Rodriguez's announcement was professionally delivered, but his pacing was slightly faster than normal, and there was a barely perceptible tightness in his tone. Most passengers, if they noticed anything at all, would attribute it to routine pilot professionalism. But Frida's trained ear caught something that made her unconsciously straighten in her seat. When the announcement ended, she noticed increased activity in the forward cabin area. Flight attendants were moving more purposefully, and she caught fragments of hushed conversations that suggested coordination around some kind of developing issue. The businessman in 12A stirred and asked James for another pillow. During their interaction, Frida overheard James mention something about possible weather delays and nothing to worry about. The phrase itself wasn't concerning, but the way James delivered it, with practiced reassurance that seemed designed to prevent passenger anxiety, suggested there might be more to the situation than routine weather adjustments. Frida's military experience had taught her that when authority figures went out of their way to emphasize that everything was fine, it usually meant something wasn't fine. The pattern was familiar: controlled information flow, maintained routine operations, and careful management of civilian morale while professionals handled the real problem behind the scenes. She began paying closer attention to the flight crews, movements and communications, not in an obvious way that would attract attention, but with the subtle observation techniques that had become second nature during her service years. What she observed over the next 30 minutes confirmed her suspicions. The crew was managing some kind of situation that they hadn't disclosed to the passengers. Radio communications seemed more frequent, crew members were checking equipment more thoroughly than normal, and there was a subtle shift in the aircraft's flight pattern that suggested they might be adjusting course. But when other passengers asked questions or made casual comments about the flight, the crew's responses were perfectly calibrated to maintain confidence and prevent concern. They were good at their jobs, and most passengers remained completely unaware that anything might be developing. Frida respected their professionalism, but she also understood that her unique background might become relevant if whatever they were managing escalated beyond routine crew procedures. She remained quiet in 14B, watching and waiting, while the flight attendants continued to see her as just another anxious passenger who needed to be managed rather than informed. The stage was being set for a crisis that would reveal just how wrong their assumptions had been. While the flight crew managed their developing situation with professional discretion, Frida Thompson sat quietly in 14B, conducting her own assessment of resources and capabilities. To anyone watching, she appeared to be reading her novel or staring out the window, but she was actually running through protocols and procedures that had been drilled into her during 4 years of Military service. Her mental inventory was comprehensive and automatic. She had already identified every passenger who appeared to have physical capability and emotional stability that might be useful in an emergency situation. The businessman in 12A was fit and appeared calm under pressure based on his focused work behavior throughout the flight. The college student in 15A had the build of an athlete and had helped an elderly passenger with her overhead bag during boarding. The off-duty nurse in row 8 had identified herself during a casual conversation. James had overheard about medical careers. More importantly, Frida had been quietly cataloging the aircraft's emergency equipment and medical supplies. During her trips to the lavatory, she had noted the location of portable oxygen bottles, defibrillation equipment, and emergency medical kits. Her training had taught her that in crisis situations, knowing where resources were located could save critical seconds that determined outcomes. She had also been listening to the aircraft's engine patterns and monitoring subtle changes in cabin pressure and ambient noise that most passengers wouldn't notice. Her deployment experience had included extensive training in aircraft systems, both for medical evacuation coordination and because combat medics often had to work in damaged or compromised aircraft during emergency extractions. What she was hearing now suggested that Flight LH-447 was dealing with more than routine weather adjustments. The engine pitch had changed slightly over the past hour, indicating possible power modifications. There had been subtle altitude changes that felt different from normal turbulence avoidance maneuvers. Most tellingly, she had noticed that the crew's routine safety checks had become more frequent and thorough. During her most recent lavatory visit, Frida had observed that the flight attendants were quietly inventorying emergency equipment and discussing contingency procedures in hushed tones. She caught fragments of conversation that included technical terms related to emergency landing protocols and passenger preparation procedures. Her military medical background included extensive training in triage and mass casualty situations. She understood that in aviation emergencies, the first few minutes often determined whether a manageable situation became a catastrophic one. Training scenarios had taught her that civilian passengers typically required several minutes to process emergency instructions and respond appropriately, time that might not be available depending on the nature of the crisis. From her window seat, Frida could see that they were still over the Atlantic Ocean, at least 3 hours from the nearest major airport. If the crew was preparing for emergency procedures, they were dealing with a situation that couldn't wait for routine landing and ground-based emergency response. She began making her own quiet preparations. Without attracting attention, she adjusted her clothing and footwear for maximum mobility. She mentally rehearsed the location of her personal identification and medical certification documents, which might become relevant if her professional background needed to be established quickly. Most importantly, she shifted her mental state from passive observation to active readiness. This psychological preparation was something civilians rarely understood. Military training didn't just teach technical skills. It taught how to maintain calm functionality while adrenaline flooded your system, how to make critical decisions when complete information wasn't available, and how to assume leadership responsibility when circumstances demanded it. Frida had hoped she would never need these skills again after completing her military service. She had been looking forward to civilian life in New York, where her biggest challenges would be graduate school applications and finding an affordable apartment. The quiet young woman that her fellow passengers observed was the person she wanted to be. Someone who could read novels on long flights and worry about ordinary things like jet lag and homesickness. But as the subtle signs of developing crisis continued to accumulate, she felt the familiar mental shift that had kept her alive during 2 combat deployments. Her pulse remained steady, her breathing controlled, and her mind clear. She wasn't hoping for an emergency, but she was prepared for one in ways that none of her fellow passengers could match. The flight attendants continued to see her as a shy European tourist who needed minimal attention. Captain Rodriguez and First Officer Walsh were focused on managing whatever technical challenges they were facing in the cockpit. The other passengers remained blissfully unaware that anything was developing beyond normal flight operations. Only Frida understood that the quiet young woman in seat 14B might soon become the most important person on flight LH447. She closed her novel and waited, ready to transform from invisible passenger to emergency responder if the situation demanded it. The next hour would determine whether her preparations were necessary or simply the overcautious habits of someone trained for worst-case scenarios. Either way, she was ready. The first indication that something was seriously wrong came at 2:47 a.m. Eastern Time, when Captain Rodriguez's voice crackled through the cabin speakers with an announcement that immediately changed the atmosphere on flight LH447. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing a technical issue that requires us to divert from our planned route to New York. As a precautionary measure, we'll be making an unscheduled landing at Gander Airport in Newfoundland. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for arrival procedures. The announcement was delivered with professional calm, but experienced travelers immediately recognized the code words that indicated a serious situation. Technical issue and precautionary measure were airline euphemisms for problems that posed actual risks to flight safety. Passengers who had been sleeping sat up abruptly, confusion and concern spreading through the cabin like a wave. The businessman in 1-2, he immediately powered on his phone to check flight tracking apps, while the family in row 16 began whispering urgent questions to each other in German. From her window seat, Frida could see the crew's response protocol shifting into emergency mode. Sarah Chun was moving through the cabin with practiced efficiency, but her body language had changed from routine service to crisis management. James Morrison was securing loose equipment and checking emergency stations with the focused intensity of someone preparing for potential disaster. What most passengers couldn't see was the situation developing in the cockpit. Captain Rodriguez and First Officer Walsh were dealing with a cascade of system failures that had begun with what appeared to be routine hydraulic pressure fluctuations. Within 20 minutes, they had lost primary hydraulic systems, backup power was operating at reduced capacity, and several critical flight control mechanisms were responding sluggishly. The aircraft was still flyable, but barely. Every control input required exceptional skill and concentration, and they were burning through backup power reserves faster than calculated. Gander Airport was the nearest facility with runways long enough to accommodate their aircraft in emergency. Equipment capable of handling a potential crash landing. Ladies and gentlemen, Rodriguez's voice returned to the speakers, this time with barely controlled tension. Due to the nature of our technical difficulties, we need to prepare for the possibility of an emergency landing. Flight attendants will now demonstrate emergency procedures. Please give them your complete attention. The word emergency sent a shockwave through the cabin. Several passengers immediately began crying, while others grabbed their phones to send what might be final messages to family members. The controlled atmosphere of routine air travel evaporated, replaced by the raw terror of people who realized they might not survive the next few hours. Sarah Chun stood at the front of the cabin and began demonstrating emergency positions and evacuation procedures, but her voice was strained and several passengers were too panicked to focus on her instructions. In row 18, an elderly man was hyperventilating, while the mother in row 16 was trying to calm her crying children while fighting her own obvious terror. Businessman in 12A was on his phone frantically trying to reach someone, his professional composure completely shattered. "We're going down," he kept repeating into the phone. "The plane is going down." It was at this moment that Frida Thompson made a decision that would change everything. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up in the aisle, her voice cutting through the chaos with calm authority. Everyone needs to listen carefully to the flight attendant's instructions. Panic will not help anyone survive this situation. Her tone was completely different from the soft, hesitant voice passengers had heard during routine interactions. This was the voice of someone accustomed to taking command in crisis situations, someone who understood that leadership in emergencies was about projecting confidence and competence when others were paralyzed by fear. Sarah Chun looked up in surprise, momentarily thrown off her emergency script by the unexpected intervention. Several passengers turned to look at the young woman who had been virtually invisible for most of the flight, now standing with military posture and speaking with unshakable authority. "Ma'am, please return to your seat," Sarah said, trying to maintain her position as the crew member in charge of passenger safety. "I'm a combat medic with the Norwegian Armed Forces," Frida replied, her accent now clearly audible but her English precise and professional. "I have extensive training in emergency response and mass casualty situations. How can I assist the crew?" The announcement stunned everyone within hearing range. The quiet European tourist who had barely spoken during the 8-hour flight had just revealed herself to be military, medical personnel with exactly the kind of training that might be crucial in an aviation emergency. Sarah Chun stared at her for a moment, processing this completely unexpected development. Around them, other passengers had stopped their panicking to listen to the exchange between the flight attendant and the woman who had just transformed from invisible passenger to potential lifesaver. Captain Rodriguez's voice crackled through the intercom again. "Flight attendants to the cockpit immediately. We have approximately 45 minutes before we attempt landing at Gander." The crisis had officially begun, and the quiet woman in seat 14B was no longer quiet. Sarah Chun's first instinct was to maintain protocol, even as Flight LH-447 flew toward what might be a catastrophic emergency landing. Her training emphasized that during crisis situations, crew members needed to maintain authority and control over passenger behavior. Allowing passengers to take initiative, no matter how qualified they claimed to be, could lead to chaos and conflicting instructions that might worsen the situation. "Ma'am, I appreciate your offer to help, but I need you to return to your seat and follow standard emergency procedures," Sarah said firmly, her voice carrying the authority of 15 years' experience managing difficult situations. "Our crew is trained to handle aviation emergencies, and passenger intervention can create confusion that puts everyone at greater risk." Around them, other passengers were watching the exchange with growing anxiety. The businessman in 1-2 had ended his phone call and was staring at Frida with a mixture of hope and skepticism. "Are you really military?" he asked, his voice cracking with stress. "Norwegian Armed Forces, combat medic specialist. 4 years active duty, including 2 deployments." Frida replied, her credentials delivered with matter-of-fact precision. "I'm trained in emergency medicine, trauma response, and mass casualty coordination." James Morrison, who had been securing the galley area, overheard the conversation and approached with obvious doubt. In his 3 years of flying, he had encountered passengers who claimed various professional qualifications during stressful situations, doctors who turned out to be medical students, military personnel who had served briefly in non-combat roles, and well-meaning individuals who overestimated their ability to help during actual emergencies. "Look, miss," he said, not unkindly but with clear dismissal, "we appreciate that you want to help, but aviation emergencies are different from whatever military training you might have. The best thing you can do is stay calm, follow our instructions, and let the professionals handle this situation." The word "professionals" carried a subtle sting, implying that despite her claimed military background, she wasn't qualified to assist in their specific type of emergency. It was the same tone that Frida had heard countless times during her military service, civilian authorities who couldn't conceive that a young European woman might possess skills and experience that exceeded their own. Captain Rodriguez's voice crackled through the intercom with increasing urgency. "Flight attendants, I need you in the cockpit now. We're losing hydraulic pressure faster than anticipated, and our backup systems are not responding as expected." Sarah looked torn between responding to the captain's summons and managing the passenger situation that was developing in the cabin. Several other passengers were now standing in the aisles, their anxiety feeding off the tension between the crew and the woman claiming military credentials. "Please, everyone return to your seats," Sarah announced to the cabin. "Our flight crew is handling the situation, and the safest thing for all passengers is to remain seated and follow standard emergency procedures." Frida remained standing, her military training telling her that the crew was making a critical mistake by not utilizing available resources. In combat situations, rejecting qualified assistance because of protocol considerations was the kind of decision that led to preventable casualties. "With respect," she said, her voice carrying the controlled intensity of someone accustomed to life or death decision-making. "If this aircraft is going to attempt an emergency landing with compromised systems, you're going to need medical personnel who can handle mass trauma situations. I'm not asking to fly the plane. I'm offering medical expertise that your crew doesn't have." James shook his head, his frustration evident. "Ma'am, we have medical kits and trained crew members. We don't need passengers taking charge of emergency procedures they don't understand." The dismissal was complete and final. From the crew's perspective, they were dealing with a passenger who was trying to insert herself into a crisis situation based on claimed qualifications that couldn't be verified. Their training emphasized maintaining clear lines of authority and not allowing passengers to assume responsibilities that belonged to the crew. What they didn't understand was that Frida's military medical training had specifically included aviation emergency scenarios. She had worked on medical evacuation flights, had treated casualties in damaged aircraft, and had been trained to coordinate with flight crews during emergency situations. Her expertise wasn't theoretical. It was based on real experience with exactly the type of crisis they were now facing. But sitting in seat 14B reading a romance novel for 8 hours, she had appeared to be exactly what they expected, a young civilian passenger who would need to be managed and protected during an emergency, not someone who could contribute to their survival. The irony was that while Captain Rodriguez struggled with failing aircraft systems and needed every available resource to ensure passenger survival, his own crew was rejecting the most qualified medical assistance on the aircraft because they couldn't see past their preconceptions about who she was. "Return to your seat immediately," Sarah said with finality. "That's not a request. It's an order for the safety of everyone on this aircraft." Frida looked at her for a long moment, then nodded and sat down. But she didn't fasten her seatbelt, and her posture remained alert and ready. She understood that the crew's dismissal wasn't personal. It was institutional blindness that prevented them from recognizing resources that didn't fit their expectations. In 30 minutes, when their aircraft attempted to land with failing systems and potentially injured passengers, they would discover just how costly that blindness could be. 28 minutes before their scheduled emergency landing at Gander Airport, Flight LH-447 encountered the kind of crisis that separated theoretical training from real-world survival skills. Captain Rodriguez's voice came through the cabin, speakers with barely controlled urgency that sent ice through every passenger's veins. "Ladies and gentlemen, our situation has deteriorated. We've lost all hydraulic systems and are operating on emergency backup power only. I need everyone to assume crash positions immediately and prepare for a very difficult landing." The cabin erupted into chaos. Several passengers began screaming, while others frantically tried to call family members despite being told to turn off electronic devices. The elderly man in row 18 was now having what appeared to be a panic attack, his breathing rapid and shallow. In row 16, the German family was crying and holding each other, the parents trying to shield their children from the reality that they might all die in the next half hour. Sarah Chun and James Morrison were moving through the cabin trying to enforce emergency procedures, but they were overwhelmed by the scale of passenger panic and their own visible stress about the deteriorating situation. Sarah's hands were shaking as she demonstrated crash positions, and James had to pause twice to collect himself before continuing his safety announcements. From her seat in 14B, Frida watched the scene with the clinical assessment skills that had kept her alive in combat zones. The crew was losing control of the passenger situation at exactly the moment when coordination and comm would be most critical for survival. In less than 30 minutes, this aircraft would attempt a landing that might result in fire, structural damage, and mass casualties requiring immediate medical attention. The moral crossroads she faced was stark and familiar. During her deployment in Afghanistan, she had encountered similar moments when following protocol meant accepting preventable deaths, while taking initiative meant risking court-martial for disobeying orders. Military command structure existed, for good reasons, but it wasn't infallible, and sometimes individual judgment had to override institutional authority. Captain Rodriguez's voice crackled through the speakers again. "Flight attendants, please report passenger status and confirm that all safety procedures are being followed." Sarah keyed her intercom while trying to calm a hysterical passenger. "Captain, we have multiple passengers in severe distress. We're having difficulty maintaining order in the cabin." The response was immediate and grim. "Copy that. Be advised, we have approximately 18 minutes to touchdown, and our landing approach will be extremely unstable. All crew members need to ensure passengers are properly positioned and prepared for impact." Frida made her decision. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, her voice cutting through the cabin noise with military command authority. "Everyone listen to me now. I am a combat medic with emergency response training, and I need your attention if you want to survive the next 20 minutes." The transformation was immediate and startling. The quiet European tourist who had sat invisibly in 14B for 8 hours was gone, replaced by someone whose bearing and voice commanded instant attention. Even the panicking passengers stopped their hysteria to look at her. Sarah Chun spun around from 3 rows away. "Ma'am, I ordered you to remain seated. You are interfering with emergency procedures." "Your emergency procedures are failing," Frida replied, her voice carrying across the cabin. "Half your passengers are too panicked to follow instructions. You have at least one passenger having a medical emergency, and you're going to need organized triage the moment this aircraft touches ground." James Morrison was approaching down the aisle, his authority challenged by a passenger who was taking control of his cabin. "You need to sit down immediately, or I'll have you restrained for the safety of other passengers." The threat was real. Frida understood that if she continued to defy crew orders, they might physically restrain her, removing her ability to help when the aircraft crashed. But she also understood that their approach was failing catastrophically, and people were going to die unnecessarily because the crew couldn't adapt their protocols to utilize available resources. "Look around you," she said, gesturing to the chaos in the cabin. "Your passengers are not following emergency procedures because they're too terrified to think clearly. In 18 minutes, some of them are going to be seriously injured and need immediate medical attention. I am the only person on this aircraft with combat trauma training." The businessman in 12A, who had been watching the exchange with growing hope, suddenly spoke up. "Let her help. For God's sake, if she's really military medical, we need her." Other passengers began voicing agreement. The off-duty nurse in row 8 called out, "I'm a registered nurse, and I think she's right. We need medical coordination if this goes badly." Sarah Chun found herself facing a passenger revolt led by someone whose credentials she couldn't verify but whose competence was increasingly obvious. The crew training that emphasized maintaining authority was colliding with the reality that their authority wasn't sufficient for the crisis they were facing. "I cannot allow passengers to override crew instructions during an emergency," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. Around her, the cabin was still chaotic, passengers were still panicking, and the aircraft was still flying toward a potentially catastrophic landing with failing systems. Frida looked directly at her, speaking with the calm certainty of someone who had made similar decisions under fire. In 15 minutes, this aircraft is going to attempt a landing that may result in casualties, fires, and evacuation emergencies. You can either work with the most qualified medical person on board, or you can maintain protocol while people die unnecessarily. The choice was clear, brutal, and immediate. Sarah could continue asserting crew authority over someone who was demonstrably better qualified to handle the medical aspects of their crisis, or she could admit that her training hadn't prepared her for this level of emergency and accept help from someone whose training had. Captain Rodriguez's voice cut through the tension. All crew members, we have 12 minutes to touchdown. Weather conditions at Gander are deteriorating, and we're going to have one chance at this approach. Sarah Chun looked at Frida Thompson, at the chaos around them, and at the reality that protocol might not be sufficient to save the lives she was responsible for protecting. The moral crossroads had arrived, and someone had to choose between following orders and saving lives. Sarah Chun's decision came in the form of a single resigned nod. What do you need? She asked, abandoning 15 years of protocol training in favor of pragmatic survival. The transformation in cabin dynamics was immediate. Frida moved into the aisle with the fluid efficiency of someone accustomed to taking command in crisis situations. Her military bearing, instantly recognizable to passengers who had been terrified moments before. James, I need you to identify passengers with medical training or emergency response experience, she said, using the flight attendant's first name with casual authority. Sarah, show me the location of all medical equipment and emergency supplies. We have 11 minutes to prepare for mass casualty triage. Her voice carried across the cabin as she addressed the passengers directly. Listen carefully. In 10 minutes, this aircraft will attempt an emergency landing. Some of you may be injured, and all of you need to follow specific procedures to maximize survival chances. I am going to organize you into groups based on your seating location and physical capability. The businessman in 12, I immediately raised his hand. I'm in good physical condition, and I want to help. What do you need me to do? Excellent, Frida replied, pointing to him. You're now responsible for passengers in rows 10 through 15. Make sure everyone knows their nearest emergency exit and has removed sharp objects from their pockets. Check that elderly passengers and children are properly positioned. She turned to the college student in 15A. You look athletic. I need you to take rows 16 through 20. Same responsibilities. Plus, I want you to identify anyone who might need assistance evacuating quickly. The off-duty nurse in row 8 called out, I'm Sarah Mitchell, registered nurse from Toronto General Hospital. How can I help? Perfect, Frida said, her organizational skills evident as she rapidly deployed available resources. You're my medical second. After landing, you handle minor injuries and shock cases while I deal with trauma. Are you comfortable with that division of responsibility? Absolutely, Nurse Mitchell replied, already moving toward the medical supply storage area. Captain Rodriguez's voice crackled through the speakers. 8 minutes to touchdown. Be advised, our approach will be very steep and we may experience significant impact. All passengers must be in crash positions. Frida had transformed the chaotic cabin into an organized emergency response unit in less than 3 minutes. Passengers who had been screaming in terror were now focused on specific tasks that gave them purpose and control. The German family in row 16 was helping other passengers check their seatbelts and remove jewelry that might cause injury during impact. James Morrison found himself following orders from a passenger, but he realized that her commands made more sense than anything in his emergency training manual. The defibrillator is in the forward galley, he reported. Medical supplies are stored above row 6 and in the aft galley. Good, Frida replied, checking her watch. After impact, if the aircraft is stable, we establish triage in the forward cabin area. James, you're responsible for coordinating evacuation through the emergency exits. Sarah, you help me assess casualties and prioritize medical treatment. Her unauthorized assumption of command was complete, but it felt natural rather than rebellious. The crew members were following her instructions because her instructions were better than their protocol training. And the passengers were calm because someone with obvious expertise was taking charge of their survival. The elderly man in row 18, who had been hyperventilating, was now breathing normally, focused on the simple task of helping his seatmate secure loose items. The crying children in row 16 had stopped panicking because their parents were no longer panicking, and everyone around them was working purposefully toward a common goal. 5 minutes to touchdown, Rodriguez announced. Landing gear deployment was successful, but we're coming in fast and steep. Everyone must be in crash positions now. Frida moved through the cabin one final time, checking that passengers were properly positioned and mentally noting who might need immediate attention after impact. Her combat training had taught her to visualize casualty scenarios before they occurred, so she was already planning treatment priorities based on seating locations and impact vectors. Remember, she called out as she returned to her own seat. Stay in crash position until the aircraft comes to complete stop. Do not attempt to stand or move until I give the all clear. If you smell smoke or see fire, follow evacuation procedures exactly as demonstrated. As Flight LH447 began its final approach to Gander Airport, the cabin was quiet except for the sound of prayer and controlled breathing. Frida had taken an aircraft full of terrified passengers and turned them into an organized survival unit. In less than 8 minutes, she strapped herself into seat 14B and assumed crash position, but her mind was already working through post-impact procedures. If the landing was successful but resulted in injuries, she would have medical supplies positioned, trained assistants ready, and evacuation routes planned. If the landing was catastrophic, she would have the maximum number of people prepared to help each other survive. Captain Rodriguez's voice came through the speakers one final time. Brace for impact. This is going to be rough. The quiet European tourist who had been invisible for 8 hours had just saved Flight LH447 before it even touched the ground. Now she had to prove that her unauthorized mission could save lives after the crash as well. The aircraft shuddered as it approached the runway, and Frida Thompson prepared to demonstrate why sometimes disobeying orders was the most important thing a soldier could do. Flight LH447 hit the runway at Gander Airport with the violent impact of a controlled crash rather than a routine landing. The aircraft bounced twice, skidded sideways as Captain Rodriguez fought to maintain directional control with failed hydraulic systems, and finally came to rest at a sharp angle with its left wing damaged and emergency vehicles already racing across the tarmac. For 30 seconds after the aircraft stopped moving, the cabin was silent except for the sound of settling metal and distant sirens. Then Frida Thompson's voice cut through the stillness with calm authority. All clear. Medical team, begin assessment. Everyone else remain seated until I determine it's safe to move. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, immediately scanning the cabin for injuries and structural damage. The impact had been severe enough to cause several passenger injuries, but her pre-crash organization had prevented the chaos that typically followed aviation emergencies. Sarah Mitchell, she called to the nurse. I need you to check passengers in rows 15 through 20 for injuries. James, verify that all emergency exits are functional. Sarah Chun, coordinate with ground emergency services. The businessman in 12A, who had taken a hard impact that left him with a bleeding head wound, was already being helped by the college student she had assigned to his section. I'm okay, he called out, though blood was running down his face. Everyone in my section is conscious and responsive. Near the back of the aircraft, the situation was more serious. The elderly man in row 18 had suffered what appeared to be a broken arm during impact, and one of the German children was unconscious, though breathing steadily. Frida moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, conducting rapid triage assessments that would have impressed emergency room doctors. "This passenger needs immediate attention," she called out, kneeling beside the unconscious child. Her hands moved with the precision of someone who had treated battlefield casualties, checking pupils, pulse, and breathing patterns. Possible concussion, stable vital signs. "We need to monitor for changes, but he's not critical." The child's mother was crying and speaking rapidly in German, but Frida's calm demeanor and obvious medical competence reassured her more than translation could have. The woman nodded when Frida indicated that her son would be okay. Understanding the universal language of professional medical assessment. Captain Rodriguez's voice came through the cabin speakers, strained but relieved. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are safely on the ground at Gander Airport. Emergency vehicles are in position, and medical personnel are boarding the aircraft to assist anyone who needs attention." When the airport emergency medical team entered the cabin, they expected to find the typical post-crash chaos: panicked passengers, overwhelmed crew members, and injuries that hadn't been properly assessed or treated. Instead, they found an organized triage operation that had already identified and prioritized every casualty. "Who's in charge of medical?" asked the lead paramedic, a veteran named Tom Bradley, who had responded to dozens of aviation emergencies. "That would be me," Frida replied, approaching him with a clipboard where she had documented every passenger's condition and treatment priority. "Frida Thompson, combat medic, Norwegian Armed Forces. I've completed initial assessment and have 3 passengers requiring immediate transport, 7 with minor injuries, and 1 possible concussion that needs monitoring." Bradley stared at her for a moment, processing the fact that a passenger had essentially done his job before he arrived. "You're military medical?" 4 years active duty, including trauma specialization, she replied, handing him her documentation. "All critical patients are stabilized and ready for transport. Minor injuries are being treated by Nurse Mitchell near the front of the aircraft." The professional handoff was seamless and exceeded anything Bradley had experienced in civilian aviation emergencies. Typically, it took emergency responders 20 to 30 minutes to assess casualties and establish treatment priorities. Frida had accomplished this in under 10 minutes while also maintaining cabin order and coordinating with the flight crew. "Ma'am," Bradley said with obvious respect, "this is exceptional work. How did you manage to organize all this so quickly?" Sarah Chun, who was helping coordinate passenger evacuation, overheard the question and answered before Frida could respond. "She took charge when our emergency procedures weren't sufficient. We tried to stop her at first because she was violating protocol, but she saved lives by ignoring our orders." The irony wasn't lost on anyone involved. The crew had initially dismissed Frida as an inexperienced passenger who needed to be managed during the crisis, but she had proven to be the most qualified person on the aircraft to handle exactly the type of emergency they encountered. James Morrison, who was helping elderly passengers exit the aircraft, shook his head in amazement. 8 hours I spent thinking she was just a nervous tourist who couldn't handle flying. She probably knows more about emergency medicine than our entire crew combined." As passengers were evacuated and transported to medical facilities, word of Frida's unauthorized leadership spread among the emergency responders and airport personnel. The quiet European woman who had been invisible in seat 14B had not only saved flight LH447 from panic-induced catastrophe, but had also established professional-level emergency medical care that minimized injury severity and accelerated treatment. Captain Rodriguez, who had successfully landed a crippled aircraft through extraordinary skill, sought out Frida as she finished briefing the medical team on patient conditions. "Miss Thompson," he said, extending his hand. "I understand that you took charge of passenger safety when my crew was overwhelmed. Thank you for stepping up when protocol wasn't sufficient." "Just doing what needed to be done, Captain," she replied. "Your landing skills saved everyone's lives. I just helped organize the aftermath." But everyone involved understood that her contribution had been far more significant than modest deflection suggested. The impossible achievement wasn't just that a passenger had successfully coordinated emergency medical response. It was that she had done it better than the professionals whose job it was supposed to be. Flight LH-447's emergency landing would become a case study in aviation safety schools, not because of the technical challenges Captain Rodriguez overcame, but because of how one passenger's refusal to accept limitations had transformed a potential disaster into a textbook example of effective crisis management. The quiet woman in 14B had proven that sometimes the most important expertise comes from the most unexpected sources. 3 hours after flight LH-447's emergency landing, Frida Thompson sat in the Gander Airport medical facility, finally allowing herself to be examined by the same paramedic team she had been coordinating during the aircraft evacuation. The adrenaline was wearing off, and she was beginning to feel the physical effects of the crash landing and the intense stress of managing a mass casualty situation. Tom Bradley, the lead paramedic, was checking her for injuries while reviewing the documentation she had created during the emergency. "You know," he said, examining a bruise on her shoulder, "in 23 years of emergency response, I've never seen passenger-initiated triage this comprehensive. You essentially did our job before we got there." "I just did what my training taught me," Frida replied, wincing as he checked her ribs for fractures. "When people are hurt and scared, someone has to take charge." Bradley nodded toward his clipboard, where he had been comparing her passenger assessments with his team's subsequent medical evaluations. "Your diagnoses were accurate in every case. The child with the suspected concussion, the elderly man's arm fracture, even the severity rankings for the minor injuries. That's not basic first aid, that's advanced trauma assessment." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sarah, Chun, and James Morrison, who had completed their post-incident interviews with aviation safety investigators. Both looked exhausted, but relieved that the crisis was over and that their passengers had survived with relatively minor injuries. "Frida," Sarah said, approaching with obvious mixed feelings, "we need to talk about what happened during the emergency." The fade tone wasn't hostile, but it carried the weight of institutional authority reasserting itself now that the immediate crisis had passed. During the emergency, pragmatic survival had overridden protocol concerns, but in the aftermath, there would need to be an accounting of how and why normal procedures had been abandoned. "I understand," Frida replied, recognizing the familiar dynamic from her military experience. Authority figures who had been grateful for unauthorized initiative during a crisis often became uncomfortable with the precedent it set once the danger had passed. James Morrison pulled up a chair, his expression serious. "Look, we're not ungrateful. You probably saved lives by taking charge when our emergency procedures weren't working. But you also completely ignored crew authority and took over functions that weren't your responsibility as a passenger." "I did what was necessary to prevent casualties," Frida said simply. "Your crew was overwhelmed by passenger panic. You had no one with trauma medical training, and people were going to be seriously injured in a few minutes. Someone had to coordinate a medical response." Sarah shook her head, her frustration evident. "But that someone should have been us. We're the trained professionals, the ones responsible for passenger safety. When passengers start making command decisions during emergencies, it breaks down the entire system that keeps aviation safe." The confrontation was predictable and familiar to Frida. During her military service, she had faced similar situations when her independent decisions had saved lives, but violated chain of command protocols. The tension between effective results and institutional authority was a constant challenge in hierarchical organizations. "Your system was failing," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "Half your passengers were too panicked to follow instructions. You had no medical personnel to handle casualties, and your emergency protocols weren't designed for the level of crisis we were facing." Tom Bradley, who had been listening to the exchange while completing his medical examination, looked up from his clipboard. "If I may interrupt," he said, "from an emergency response perspective, what she did was textbook mass casualty coordination. Her triage decisions were professional level, her resource deployment was efficient, and her leadership prevented the kind of panic that usually makes our job much more difficult." James leaned forward, his tone becoming more confrontational. "But that's not the point. She's a passenger, not a crew member. If every passenger with some kind of professional background decides they know better than the crew during emergencies, we'll have chaos instead of coordinated response. And if crew members refuse to utilize qualified resources because of protocol concerns, people die unnecessarily," Frida countered. "I didn't take over your aircraft or override safety procedures. I provided medical expertise that your crew didn't have during a situation that required it." Sarah ran her hands through her hair, the stress of the day evident in her posture. "Look, I'm personally grateful that you were on our flight. But from a regulatory standpoint, passenger interference with crew authority during emergencies sets a dangerous precedent. Airlines can't function if passengers decide for themselves when and how to help." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone involved. Frida's unauthorized actions had demonstrably improved outcomes for everyone on flight LH447. But those same actions had violated fundamental principles of aviation safety that existed for good reasons. Knock on the medical facility door interrupted the conversation. Airport Security Supervisor Margaret Wilson entered with a clipboard and an expression that suggested official business. "Miss Thompson," she said, "I need to inform you that your actions during the emergency are being reviewed by Transport Canada aviation safety investigators. While no charges are being filed, your assumption of crew responsibilities without authorization is a matter that requires official documentation." The confrontation had escalated from crew concerns to regulatory investigation. Frida understood that her decision to ignore crew authority and take charge of emergency medical response would now become part of an official record that might affect how similar situations were handled in the future. "I understand," she said, accepting the situation with the same calm she had maintained throughout the crisis. "I acted according to my training and judgment to prevent casualties. I'm prepared to explain my decisions to any investigating authority." The quiet woman who had transformed from invisible passenger to emergency coordinator now faced the consequences of proving that sometimes disobeying orders was the right thing to do. The aviation safety investigation hearing took place 3 days later in a sterile conference room at Transport Canada's regional office in Halifax. Frida Thompson sat across from a panel of 3 investigators, her military service records spread across the table alongside incident reports from flight LH447's crew and passengers. Investigator Patricia Wells, a 20-year veteran of aviation safety, opened the session by reviewing the sequence of events that had led to Frida's unauthorized assumption of emergency medical coordination. Her tone was professional but clearly skeptical of passenger intervention in crew responsibilities. "Ms. Thompson," Wells began, consulting her notes, "you acknowledge that you deliberately disobeyed direct orders from certified flight attendants during a declared emergency. Can you explain why you felt authorized to override crew authority?" "I didn't feel authorized," Frida replied calmly. "I felt obligated. When I assessed the situation, it was clear that passenger panic was preventing effective emergency response, and the crew lacked medical training necessary for mass casualty coordination. People were going to be seriously injured in a few minutes. and there was no qualified medical personnel to handle trauma cases. Investigator James Chun, a former airline captain, leaned forward with obvious concern. But aviation safety depends on clear command structure during emergencies. If passengers start making independent decisions about when crew procedures are inadequate, we undermine the entire system that keeps commercial aviation safe. With respect, Frida responded, the system was already undermined by its failure to utilize available resources. I have 4 years of military medical training, including combat trauma specialization. The crew had basic first aid certification. When facing potential mass casualties from an emergency landing, which approach serves passenger safety better? The third investigator, Dr. Michael Torres from the Aviation Medical Division, had been reviewing Frida's military service records throughout the discussion. Ms. Thompson, your medical credentials are impressive, but they don't include civilian aviation emergency training. How do you justify taking medical command in an environment you weren't specifically trained for? Because medical emergencies are medical emergencies regardless of location, she replied. A traumatic brain injury from aircraft impact requires the same assessment and treatment whether it occurs in Afghanistan or over the Atlantic Ocean. My training included working with aircraft casualties during medical evacuation operations. Wells shuffled through passenger statements that had been collected after the emergency. Several witnesses report that your intervention significantly reduced panic and improved coordination during the crisis. However, crew members express concern that your actions established a dangerous precedent for passenger interference. The moral complexity of the situation was evident in every exchange. Frida's actions had demonstrably improved outcomes for everyone on Flight LH447. But those same actions had violated fundamental principles designed to maintain safety through disciplined adherence to established procedures. Sarah Chun, who had been called to testify, entered the room with obvious reluctance. Her 15 years of flight experience had taught her to respect authority and protocol, but she couldn't deny what she had witnessed during the emergency. Ms. Chun, Wells addressed her, in your professional opinion, did Ms. Thompson's intervention help or hinder emergency response efforts? Sarah paused before answering, clearly struggling with conflicting loyalties. From a procedural standpoint, passenger assumption of crew responsibilities violates everything we're trained to maintain during emergencies. But from a practical standpoint, she accomplished things that our standard procedures couldn't handle. Can you be more specific? Chun asked. Our passengers were panicking to the point where they couldn't follow basic safety instructions, Sarah admitted. We had elderly passengers having medical distress, children who were terrified, and adults who were completely losing control. Ms. Thompson organized them into functional groups, assigned responsibilities that gave them purpose instead of panic, and established medical triage before we even landed. Dr. Torres consulted his medical evaluation of the incident. Post-crash medical assessment indicates that her treatment priorities and diagnostic evaluations were accurate in every case. The emergency response team reported that her preliminary triage exceeded typical passenger capabilities. The testimony continued for 2 hours, with each witness adding layers of complexity to the central question. When, if ever, should individual expertise override institutional authority during emergencies? Captain Rodriguez, appearing via video link from Germany, where he was undergoing his own investigation, provided the most compelling perspective. Ladies and gentlemen, I was flying a crippled aircraft with failing systems toward what might have been a catastrophic crash landing. My job was to get us on the ground alive, but I couldn't also manage passenger medical response. Ms. Thompson's assumption of medical coordination allowed my crew to focus on evacuation procedures while ensuring that casualties would receive appropriate treatment. Wells reviewed her notes before addressing the central issue. Ms. Thompson, do you understand that your actions, while well-intentioned and apparently effective, created a precedent that could encourage other passengers to override crew authority based on their personal assessment of emergency situations. "I understand the concern," Frida replied. "But I also understand that rigid adherence to procedures that aren't working can cost lives. Military training teaches you to adapt to circumstances that weren't covered in the manual, because real emergencies don't always fit theoretical frameworks." The hearing concluded with Wells announcing that their findings would be forwarded to aviation authorities for policy consideration. But everyone in the room understood that the real question wasn't whether Frida Thompson had violated protocol. She clearly had. The question was whether violating protocol in this specific case had been the right thing to do. As the session ended, Dr. Torres approached Frida privately. "Off the record," he said quietly, "what you did during that emergency was exactly what I would have wanted if I were a passenger on that aircraft." The challenge for aviation safety is figuring out how to incorporate that kind of expertise without undermining the command structure that usually keeps us safe. Frida nodded, understanding both the compliment and the institutional dilemma her actions had created. Sometimes doing the right thing meant accepting that the consequences would be complicated. 2 weeks after the Transport Canada investigation, Frida Thompson received an unexpected phone call at her temporary lodging in St. John's, Newfoundland. The caller was Dr. Amanda Richardson, Director of Emergency Medical Response for the International Air Transport Association, and her proposal would change how aviation authorities thought about passenger resources during emergencies. "Ms. Thompson," Dr. Richardson began, "your actions during Flight LH447 have generated considerable discussion in aviation safety circles. We'd like to offer you a consulting position to help develop new protocols for utilizing qualified passenger assistance during medical emergencies." The offer was unprecedented. Rather than disciplining Frida for violating crew authority, the aviation industry was asking her to help redesign the system to better accommodate situations like the one she had navigated. "I'm honored by the opportunity," Frida replied, "but I want to understand what kind of changes you're considering. I don't want to be part of something that undermines flight crew authority or passenger safety." Dr. Richardson explained that the Flight LH447 incident had exposed gaps in current emergency response protocols. "Your case demonstrates that sometimes passengers possess expertise that exceeds crew capabilities in specific areas. We need to develop frameworks for identifying and utilizing these resources without compromising command structure." The paradigm shift was already underway in aviation safety conferences and regulatory discussions. Frida's unauthorized medical coordination had been so effective that it forced industry professionals to reconsider fundamental assumptions about passenger capabilities and emergency resource management. Captain Alina Vasquez, a senior training officer with a major international airline, had been following the case closely. During a pilot training seminar in Montreal, she used Flight LH447 as a case study that challenged conventional thinking about crew-passenger dynamics. "For decades, we've trained crews to manage passengers as a potential problem during emergencies," she told her audience of experienced pilots. "But the Thompson case suggests we should also train them to identify passengers as potential resources when appropriate." The shift in perspective was evident in how aviation professionals now discussed the incident. Initial reaction had focused on protocol violations and unauthorized passenger actions. But as the effectiveness of Frida's intervention became clear, the conversation evolved toward systemic improvements that could prevent similar situations. Sarah Chen, who had returned to active duty after completing her post-incident evaluation, found herself presenting the Flight LH447 case to new flight attendants during emergency training sessions. Her perspective had been fundamentally altered by witnessing how effectively passenger expertise could complement crew capabilities. "The most important lesson," she told her trainees, is that emergency situations don't always fit the scenarios we practice in training. When Miss Thompson took charge of medical coordination, my first instinct was to reassert crew authority. But she was demonstrably better qualified for that specific aspect of emergency response. The paradigm shift extended beyond individual perspectives to institutional policy changes. Airlines began developing procedures for identifying passengers with relevant professional qualifications during routine boarding processes. Medical personnel, emergency responders, and military veterans could voluntarily identify themselves to crew members, creating a resource database for potential emergency situations. James Morrison, who had initially been most resistant to Frida's intervention, became an advocate for integrating qualified passenger assistance into emergency protocols. During a flight attendant conference in Toronto, he described how the traditional approach had been insufficient for the crisis they faced. "We're trained to manage typical passenger emergencies," he explained to his colleagues. But Flight LH447 wasn't typical. We needed mass casualty medical coordination that went beyond our first aid training. Miss Thompson didn't undermine our authority. She provided expertise we didn't have. The regulatory response was equally significant. Transport Canada issued new guidelines for crew coordination with qualified passengers during medical emergencies, establishing criteria for when and how such assistance could be incorporated into official response procedures. That Dr. Torres, who had participated in Frida's investigation, was appointed to chair a working group developing international standards for passenger resource utilization. The Thompson case proved that rigid adherence to existing protocols can sometimes produce worse outcomes than adaptive response to available resources. He explained in his appointment announcement, the most telling indicator of the paradigm shift was how other airlines began treating similar situations. When an off-duty surgeon assisted during a medical emergency on a transatlantic flight 3 months later, the crew immediately incorporated her expertise into their response rather than insisting she remain in her passenger role. Aviation Trade publications, which had initially covered the Flight LH447 incident as a story about passenger insubordination, now featured it as a case study in effective emergency resource management. Professional journals published analyses of how Frida's military medical training had translated to civilian aviation emergencies. For Frida herself, the paradigm shift meant that her decision to disobey crew orders was being validated not as a one-time exception, but as an example of the kind of adaptive thinking that could improve aviation safety broadly. Her unauthorized actions had evolved from regulatory violation to industry best practice. The quiet woman who had sat invisibly in seat 14B had not only saved lives during a specific emergency, she had changed how the aviation industry thought about passenger capabilities and emergency response coordination. Sometimes individual courage to act beyond assigned roles could transform entire systems. The paradigm shift was complete, but the work of implementing new protocols was just beginning. 6 months after Flight LH447's emergency landing, Frida Thompson stood before an audience of aviation professionals at the International Conference on Emergency Response Innovation in Geneva. She wore a simple navy blazer, her appearance as unassuming as it had been in seat 14B, but now she commanded attention rather than invisibility. "When I boarded that flight in Frankfurt," she began, her voice carrying the same calm authority that had organized panicked passengers during the crisis, "I expected to spend 8 hours reading and sleeping my way to New York. I never imagined that I would need to choose between following orders and saving lives." The audience, pilots, flight attendants, emergency responders, and regulatory officials, listened with the intensity of professionals learning from a case that had already changed their industry. Frida's presentation was part of a larger conference session examining how individual initiative during emergencies could improve systematic outcomes. The most important lesson from Flight LH447 isn't about aviation safety, she continued. It's about the difference between following procedures and serving the purpose those procedures were designed to achieve. Sometimes being truly professional means having the courage to act beyond your assigned role when circumstances demand it. Her consulting work with the International Air Transport Association had led to the development of new emergency response protocols now being implemented by airlines worldwide. The Thompson protocols, as they had become known in aviation circles, provided frameworks for identifying and utilizing passenger expertise during medical emergencies while maintaining appropriate crew authority. Captain Rodriguez, who was also presenting at the conference, described how the incident had changed his approach to crew resource management. "Miss Thompson didn't undermine my authority as captain," he explained to the audience. "She provided capabilities that enhanced our overall emergency response. The key insight is learning to recognize when additional expertise improves rather than compromises safety outcomes." The legacy of Flight LH447 extended beyond aviation policy changes to broader conversations about institutional flexibility and individual responsibility. Business schools began using the case as an example of how organizational hierarchies needed to balance authority with adaptability. Military academies examined it as a study in when individual judgment should override existing protocols. Dr. Richardson, who had recruited Frida as a consultant, reported on the measurable impacts of the new protocols during her own conference presentation. "In the 6 months since implementing passenger resource identification procedures, we've documented 12 cases where qualified passenger assistance significantly improved emergency medical outcomes." The Thompson case wasn't an anomaly. It was the first example of systematic underutilization of available resources. Sarah Chun, who had become an advocate for the new approaches, described how her perspective on passenger management had evolved. "I spent 15 years seeing passengers as people to be managed during emergencies. Now I see them as potential resources to be assessed and, when appropriate, integrated into emergency response." Ms. Thompson taught us that competence doesn't always come with a uniform. The broader impact was evident in industries beyond aviation. Hospitals began examining how to better utilize the expertise of off-duty medical personnel during mass casualty events. Emergency response agencies developed protocols for incorporating qualified civilian volunteers during large-scale disasters. But for Frida personally, the most meaningful legacy was simpler and more direct. She had proven to herself and others that size, gender, nationality, and initial impressions didn't determine someone's ability to make a critical difference when lives were at stake. "The quiet young European woman in seat 14B was exactly who I was supposed to be," she told the conference audience as her presentation concluded. "But when circumstances required it, I was also a combat medic with trauma training, an emergency coordinator with leadership experience, and someone who refused to let people die while I followed inappropriate orders." The standing ovation that followed wasn't just professional appreciation. It was recognition of something more fundamental about human potential and institutional change. One person's courage to act beyond assigned limitations had transformed how an entire industry thought about emergency response and resource utilization. After the conference, Frida returned to her graduate studies in New York, where she was pursuing a degree in emergency management. Her thesis research focused on cross-training protocols that could help civilian organizations better utilize unexpected expertise during crisis situations. She still flew regularly, but now flight crews often approached her during boarding to verify her medical credentials and discuss emergency procedures. The invisible passenger had become a recognized expert whose quiet presence reassured both crew and fellow travelers. The transformation was complete but ongoing. Frida Thompson had proven that individual competence, courage, and willingness to act beyond assigned roles, could save lives and change systems. Her legacy wasn't just about one emergency landing. It was about the importance of recognizing and utilizing human potential wherever it appeared, regardless of initial assumptions or institutional boundaries. Sometimes the most important person on an aircraft was the one nobody noticed until the moment when being unnoticed no longer mattered, and being capable mattered more than anything else in the world. The quiet woman in seat 14B had become proof that limitations often exist in other people's perceptions rather than in actual capability, and that sometimes the most professional thing you can do is refuse to accept those limitations when lives depend on your expertise. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.